Keep it quick, but it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague in philosophy, Ege Yumuşak, who I won't pigeonhole her by telling you what she works on because the answer is everything. If you're interested in it, she's probably interested in it. I will also note that for an assistant professor, she has a very impressive uh, public scholarship record, and you should look up her publications for broader audiences because they're well written and very interesting. With that said, I'll just turn the time over to you.
Oh. Thank you, everyone. It's exciting to be here. I haven't been able to come to that many MindCore talks this year, but last year I came to quite a few, and it was such a great part of my day each time to sit and talk about or hear people talk about the mind. Today I'm going to be talking about curiosity and its contents, drawing on this paper of mine called Whence Interrogative Contents, but I thought the title of the paper was too cute. It's for writing purposes. So the talk is titled Curiosity and its Contents. So here's an observation. Inquiring into something often begins with a question, ones whose answer we're curious to find out. I'm interested in many things, as Carlos said. One of them is what's the relation between unemployment rates and wages? I do not have public scholarship on this question. I'm nowhere near being able to say anything intelligent about it. I'm also curious about this question. How does one make sourdough bread? It seems like we inquire when we're curious by asking a question, and we stop inquiry when our curiosity is satisfied, and we pair this question with an answer. So it seems like, at least intuitively, that there's a tight connection between being curious and questions via inquiry. The inquiry curiosity question connection. And a philosophical view suggests that a class of mental attitudes are properly described as interrogative attitudes. This involves curiosity, wondering, investigating, agnosticism. And these attitudes, some philosophers have claimed, take interrogative contents. They think that the fact that they take the special kind of content explains what these attitudes do in the mind. Their target is those who think that mental content is to be modeled by declarative sentences. Um, I want to note that the so-called orthodoxy around declarative contents is actually quite contested. Here's a 2018 OUP volume that I really love. Almost every paper in this book I really love on non-propositional intentionality. A lot of people have been thinking about mental contents that go beyond declarative, beyond what's modeled by declarative sentences for a while, but there still is this, we always have to create an orthodoxy to be able to argue against it, it seems. So here's the stipulated orthodoxy that mental content is usually expressed by relations involving relations that would be best modeled by declarative sentences. Such as, I believe that there are people here listening to me talking about this. That's a declarative sentence that models my belief. I desire to eat food at 5 p.m. when finally iftar time comes around. That's also another example. Okay. So I, by and large, I endorse some kind of interrogative content thesis, but I have worries with how this has been done so far in the literature. So some of my hesitations. I'm quite curious about bees also, but my curiosity about bees was sparked by watching this incredible film called art house documentary fictionish film called Honeyland, set in the Balkans about a single old woman beekeeper and her friendship with her dog and her relationship to her bees. My curiosity about bees that I acquired at a film festival one year has nothing to do, it's not capturable by a list of questions like whether bees have fur, how fast bees can fly, how bees can make honey. This is an example from a paper I will go on to discuss. Similarly, my curiosity about the labor market, it's not really something that I feel like would be satisfied by having some number of answers. I put my dog to take pictures with the books I like to read, to inquire into labor markets. I read a lot of pages that contain non-answers and are still somehow interesting to me. So my curiosity doesn't quite fit these curiosities that I have don't really fit the mold of what people have talked about under this banner of interrogative contents. But I have some other curiosities, such as my curiosity into baking sourdough bread, that I think fit the mold. I investigated the ideal hydration percentage, how I can determine when the dough has actually doubled in size. I aimed for a particular size of the holes in my sourdough bread, and once I hit that, I was done. No more questions asked. I was satisfied. So today, following these sorts of intuitions that I have had about this literature, I want to suggest that actually, when we talk about asking, we're talking about two kinds of different things. There are two kinds of questions, and they go nicely with two kinds of curiosity. It turns out that one of these curiosities can be modeled by interrogative contents of some kind. The other, I think, it's optional whether we model them with curiosity, with interrogative contents. I think that if we're permissive about taking the intentional stance in certain ways, we might say yes, but there's also a lot of reasons to not go there. And I believe that noticing that distinction will help us see what we've been doing wrong in philosophy of mind in general in some ways, getting a little unprincipled about folk psychology. Okay, so two kinds of curiosities. So here's one of the cases that that Jane Friedman, who is a proponent of the interrogative content thesis, is interested in. This is Alice, who is curious about bees. In Jane Friedman's presentation, Alice wonders whether bees have fur, how fast bees can fly, and how bees make honey. Therefore, Alice has the following interrogative attitudes. Alice is curious about whether bees have fur. Alice is curious about how fast bees can fly. And Alice has a curiosity directed at the question, how bees make honey. It's clear that in Jane Friedman's picture, the link between questions and interrogative attitudes is one that we can capture by thinking of questions as the object at which the attitude is directed at. Here, Jane Friedman is quite permissive about what account of questions that we might endorse, whether we think the semantics of questions would be best captured by possible answers or true answers or partitions of logical space. She's willing to admit any of those. The bulk of the argument concerns the attitude relation and how the question is motivated by thinking about the nature of curiosity. But let's still say a few words about questions. As a speech act, they are requests for information, such as in this one, where I asked, where is Remy, the Harvard cat? When I ask this question, two things happen. There might be some additions to the common ground, where we might record presuppositions of this question, that there is a cat called Remy, that Remy is placed somewhere around Harvard because Remy is called the Harvard cat. There's also an addition that we make to the agenda of this conversation, modeled by linguists as questions under discussion. And this addition motivates that I look for answers, search for answers to resolve this question. And the resolution condition of the question, I understand it by having a rational understanding of this question is that once I know the cat location, the question is resolved and I can remove the question from the agenda. So one cooperative answer to this question is to say Remy is an Emerson 102. But there is another cooperative answer, which is to say one of these things. I don't know, but Remy could be at the Barker Center or on Oxford Street. He's definitely not in the Science Center. Or to say, it's raining, he should be inside. These two are cooperative answers, I suggest, because they are preferable to me saying, I don't know the answer. And that's because they help advance inquiry. In both of these cases, the question is just as felicitous. It re-engineers context. In one case, I know the answer. In the other, I don't, but I still offer something that is cooperative. So there are many ways to be responsive to the issue. One is providing an answer. 2, making available new information relevant to the question. And 3, highlighting known information relevant to the question. What they share is that they're all responsive to the issue raised by the question. So here's what the interrogative content thesis folks are thinking. What all of these answers share is that they are responsive to the issue. Questions, it seems, even when we don't know the answer, shape conversations by putting a question into the conversation. And Alice's curiosity similarly shapes her behavior to look for answers. And we can model that also by putting a question in Alice's mind and model her curiosity, behaviors that involve her curiosity in this manner. But Alice looks for answers to B questions, and I don't. I want to suggest that what differentiates my curiosity about bees from Alice is that it seems like Alice is a little too tied to getting an answer. Alice really wants to know the answers to whether bees have fur, whereas I'm only after relevance. For me, anything that advances my understanding of bee and bee involving things is relevant to the phenomenon, and therefore, if it's not useful today, I feel like it might be useful to me later. I want to suggest that I have a question of inquiry. I'm somehow more committed to the inquiry than the answers, whereas Alice has a question of answers. In terms of my curiosity about unemployment and the labor market, this thinking about my question as a question of inquiry explains why I go around talking to economists about monopsony, even though I keep forgetting the definition of that word. I learn things like hold-up power in different sectors. When I meet a nurse, immediately I'm asking how the national nurses shortage is affecting the way they make decisions about whether to stay at a hospital or not. I'm constantly out looking for relevant facts that might either open new questions or answer questions that I already have. And none of the answers that I gain seem to satisfy me because I am committed to the inquiry. My primary relation is to the inquiry rather than the answers, unlike Alice. My inquiry is open-ended. It is, I ask you to cooperate by feeding my curiosity, not necessarily by quenching it. Whereas Alice has is asking a question in a different of a different kind. I think both of these ways of thinking about questions and cooperative answers to questions are acceptable ways, principled ways of thinking about them, So we can also say something about how Alice and I actually have different kinds of questions on our minds. One objection here that someone can make is to say, no, you don't have different kinds of questions in your minds. It's just that you lack transparency. You don't have, you, Ege, don't have access to the set of questions that are actually on your mind. Alice's inquiry, because of the scope of the inquiry, she has a list of questions. You just have a larger inquiry, and because there is no transparency of this kind in this kind of mental attitude, you just don't know the shape of your inquiry yourself. I think there's a reason not to take this route. I don't think anything I say here is entirely conclusive. I think that's a forceful objection, and I would love to hear if you think it wins at the end of the day. But I think there are some signs of genuine difference. Elsewhere, Dino Wendler talks about a distinction between different kinds of verbs, activity and accomplishment verbs, drawing on the difference between going for a run and running a mile. It seems like there are particular kinds of activities when we express them in language, we either we impose different metaphysics on them. We think about some things as accomplishments and other things as activities. Maybe what I'm saying is basically suggesting this for inquiry. There are two ways to engage with practices. One is an activity, one is as an accomplishment, and maybe questioning also is like this. The other sign of genuine difference, I think, is comes from cases where we think we have recourse to this kind of answer. So imagine a situation in which you introduce a topic of conversation that's a little touchy, and you're talking to your interlocutor. You treat it as a question of inquiry, and then you realize, actually, this is not someone that I want to inquire with. So you say this. You say, I just wanted to ask a question. I'd rather not go into this whole thing. I think we employ this sort of script switching a lot when we don't trust our interlocutors, which gives me more motivation to think that there is this genuine difference between two kinds of questions that we can ask. And there's some like-minded philosophers whose work on this I really appreciate. Daniel Drucker talks about curiosity as a source of motivation in his terminology, and he thinks of wondering as a different thing, which is something you do. For him, wondering is an activity. Curiosity is more desire-like. And Daniela Dover talks about erotic curiosity as lacking a telic structure. I won't go too much into the detail of their, okay, I was trying to locate a clock, into their views. Here's a passage from Daniela Dover's paper, which I think we should skip in the interest of time. These distinctions, I think, don't quite map onto the distinction I'm drawing between question of answers and questions of inquiry. Drucker's distinction is merely a metaphysical distinction. Wandering is not an attitude for him, it's an activity. And Daniela Dover's distinction exploits phenomenology and it appeals to desire phenomenology, whereas my proposal is going to rely on an epistemic distinction. So that's why, even though they're relevant and helpful, I think what I want to draw on to think about what this distinction and questioning will mean for the kinds of curiosities we can hold by being related to these two kinds of questions, I want to put that on an epistemic foundation by looking at the normative profile of our epistemic directedness towards inquiry via these questions. Okay. 2, what the inquirer pursues. As a reminder, here is my target, which is interesting to call it a target because I kind of agree with them, but with a caveat. There's another point of agreement between me and people who who hold the interrogative content thesis, at least on paper, were all doing folk psychology in some way. Here's a quote from Dennett. When one deals with a system, be it man, machine, or alien creature, by explaining and predicting its behavior, by citing its beliefs and desires and interrogative attitudes, one has what might be called a theory of behavior for the system. The theorists that I am drawing on who have posed these interrogative attitudes take themselves to be doing what Dennett is describing with respect to belief and desire. Here's an example of this sort of commitment from Peter Carruthers. He says, if Mary had asked something, Mary is someone else who has a curiosity. If Mary had asked something with no presumed instrumental motive, then a simple attitude explanation would have been available. Had she asked this, then she could have explained it by that. Here, Carruthers is going through the logic of an attitudinal ascription by saying, oh, if Mary does this behavior, then she must have this kind of thing in her mind, showing us that the method by which we ascribe attitudes is very much within the methodology of folk psychology, where we ascribe mental attitudes in order to explain and predict behavior. What commitments are incurred by this methodological decision? Some. When we ascribe attitudes in this way, we name an attitude, namely a relation such as belief or desire or wandering or curiosity, which names the function of that attitude. And we also name an object, some contents, and that characterization describes the conditions under which the attitude will be relating to the object in the right way. So we impose some type of success conditions on the attitude so that the behavior can be judged as rational or irrational. We're not just trying to describe what the creature will do, we're trying to describe what the creature will do when it does well, and also what it means for the creature to malfunction. That's the whole promise of functionalism, is to capture both functions and malfunctioning. So when we go back to curiosity and start thinking about what it means for curiosity to take interrogative contents, it has always seemed to me that the biggest issue with this literature has been that the function of curiosity has been underdescribed. What does the inquirer actually pursue? This is a question that hasn't been answered by theorists sufficiently who have supported the interrogative content thesis. The motivation for interrogative attitudes in their description comes from the fact that interrogative attitudes are the kinds of attitudes we have when we initiate inquiry, when we engage in inquiry. And it seems like we have these type of attitudes, Jane Friedman, for example, argues, that are distinguished from other kinds of epistemic motivations we might have. So I might have some epistemic motivations to engage in inquiry that are metacognitive in nature, whereas curiosities seem to be independent from other metacognitive attitudes. What does this mean? So it seems like I could inquire if I want to. It seems like I inquire only when I think that I don't know the answer to something. But knowing that you don't know something is incompatible with skepticism about whether you can know something. Whereas in the case of curiosity, this is not the case. I could be curious about something even if I knew that I wasn't going to be able to find out the answer to my question. That's what Jane Friedman says. So it seems like if I had deep doubts about whether I can understand labor markets, which I do, I shouldn't be engaging in my study of the capital and Grundrisse and talking to my economist friends about monopsony. Importantly, Friedman says it doesn't make us less rational to be curious into these things. Similarly, another epistemic motivation I might have to inquire would be desiring to know P, but desiring to know P is incompatible with deciding not to pursue an action that would enable us to know P. Here, Friedman has an example of opening a dangerous box. If you want to know, if you're curious about what's in the dangerous box, you might still want to open it. If I'm not opening, you wouldn't conclude that I'm not curious about it. Whereas desires don't quite work this way. Another argument in the same vein from Peter Carruthers appeals to animals and children that lack metacognition but still are curious. He appeals to bees' exploratory searches to make this point primarily, but he also thinks that humans have exploratory behaviors that don't quite we wouldn't count as metacognitive. And his example of it is someone called Mary who is searching for her keys, and for some reason we wouldn't want to say Carruthers claims that she wanted to know where her keys are. She's just expressing her questioning attitude. Well, for some reason being, it's habitual that she is engaged in this behavior, and therefore it's not metacognitive. She just has a first order desire, first order interrogative attitude. Their conclusion is that curiosity from this argument, it is curiosity is a first order epistemic motivation that's independent from beliefs and desires. Okay. My suggestion, having made the observation that we can drive a distinction between questions of inquiry and questions of answers, is that this argument applies well to questions of answers, but not, this argument applies well to questions of inquiry, but not questions of answers. Why? Because it might be functionally suboptimal to gather evidence when you don't believe you can know the answer, or when you don't desire to know the answer, but you can still do it. And suboptimality we can appeal to different other explanations of that suboptimality in your functioning, rather than rejecting that you have an attitude that cannot be expressed as a desire, or the knowledge that you don't know. Beliefs, appealing to irrationality is always an open way out of these problems. But rather than doing that, Carruthers and Friedman want to hold that Alice is acting completely rationally in these situations. What they want to say is that she just has a specific kind of attitude. Again, given that we don't know from their accounts what the function of curiosity is, buying into this argument in the case of questions of answers, I think is an ask that I, at least, cannot meet. Okay. I want to suggest that just as beliefs pursue truth, desires pursue satisfaction, inquiries that involve questions of answer pursue resolution optimally and sometimes suboptimally. And whether that means we want to model them as attitudes directed at questions or not, I think we can be permissive about that, but I don't see a reason why I wouldn't want to model my relation to a question of answer as a desire, as a desiring attitude. Okay. So rationally evaluable agents who are dead set on settling their questions I think, have beliefs about their epistemic standing, and they do have desires about their own mental states. A curious student who wants to know why they got a B plus instead of an A minus, someone I meet on the regular, desires to have a particular mental state, I think, and has beliefs about their epistemic standing. That's why that conversation takes very long. If they didn't have these things, their curiosity would be resolved quite a lot faster, but they do have these beliefs about the kind of mental state they want to be in and their epistemic standing. It's okay for Alice and Mary not to have this relation, but maybe Alice and Mary are just functioning suboptimally in those instances. How about the B? In the interest of time, I will not talk about the Peter Carruthers' argument against metacognition. I have worries about how demanding he thinks having a metacognitive attitude is for an animal. I think my sympathies lie with Robert Stalnacker's work that suggests that I think these attitudes come quite cheaply, theoretically, and animals too can have them, but that's a separate debate. I don't think metacognition has to express a very sophisticated causal mechanism. Okay, so it looks like this is bad news for the interrogative content thesis, especially, but Jane Friedman says interrogative attitudes are the sort of attitudes we typically have as we move ourselves from ignorance to knowledge. I think if she says this, then we would hope that we'd be rational in these movements, but I think they too can grant that we're sometimes not functioning optimally when we try to do that, and they can accept my argument, given that I will also give them a proper attitude that actually has interrogative contents, which is our relation to questions of inquiry. So as a reminder, I take it that we have questions of inquiry when we engage in open-ended inquiries that are relevance-guided and atelic, whereas Jane Friedman's Alice, had a question of answers, which was telic and truth-guided. I grant that this second relationship to a question can also be modeled by interrogative contents, but it doesn't exclusively need to be done that way. I'm permissive about modeling practices. If it helps us get a better explanation, sure, but I think a lot of the cases also lend themselves actually, in fact, better explanations when we take them to be desires. But questions of inquiry, I think there is some psychological functional motivations to put them aside as a proper locus of investigating into interrogative contents. And here I'm inspired by how psychologists talk about the explore-exploit dilemma, which is sometimes expressed as a behavioral dilemma when an agent faces a decision choice, a task where they need to initially acquire information to carry out the task. They might find themselves stuck in a choice. Should I explore? Should I exploit? Alison Gopnik, in this helpful review, talks about how a lot of developmental psychologists now think about childhood as a solution to explore-exploit tensions, where children over time initially become better explorers. In their mind, exploration is not random search. It is a type of inquiry where children don't engage in repetitive behavior and conduct broad searches, sometimes called high temperature searches, whereas exploitation, which is a different mode of inquiry that's not to be described by recalcitrance to reasons, but it is better described as a lower temperature search where you invest more trust in information that you already have, focusing on familiar options. So we can compare between an inquirer who samples a number of possibilities and revises the current hypotheses that they have in light of strong evidence, making the most minor adjustment possible with an inquirer who conducts a broad search for possible alternatives, entertains new hypotheses without robust evidence, and tests these hypotheses. These would be two ways of engaging in inquiry that we see psychologically developed in at different moments in time, in children especially, and that this displays this type of bifurcation in our relation to uncertainty and what to do about it. So we can take these psychological characterizations of exploration and exploitation and think about the fact that these might map well onto the bifurcation I described in our practices of asking questions. And we can call one type of curiosity I have an exploratory curiosity, the one I engage in when I'm engaged in a question, when I'm interested in pursuing a question of inquiry, and the other kind as an exploitative curiosity when I'm engaged in pursuing a question of answers. Going about theorizing about interrogative contents this way would be in the spirit of full psychological methodology, would exploit, for lack of a better word, resources that psychologists have given us, and it would also help us with rational evaluations of behavior in curious subjects, individuals. And we could apply different epistemic standards to these two modes of inquiry. I left the second desideratum that Jane Friedman has when it comes to deciding that something is an interrogative attitude unaddressed. So let me briefly return to that. In addition to her argument about from metacognitive attitudes, Jane Friedman also says that that we're sometimes curious under conditions of ignorance about possible alternatives. Okay. Oh no. Okay. Yes. Or is this passage? Sorry, my handout didn't match. Okay. Here's her text describing this condition. Part of what the suggestion that interrogative attitudes are directed at individuals correctly picks up on is that there are cases in which the objects of inquiry look very broad or general, but a very general object is not a good candidate for the contents of the more specific or focused interrogative attitude. Of course, this is not an objection to the proposals accounting for the contents of some interrogative attitudes, but I think that a uniform content is preferable. In formulating this second desideratum, Jane Friedman wheels in this motivation that maybe we should be aspiring for uniform content. I actually agree with what she says here, but I don't see the force of going for uniform content just based on ordinary speech practices, especially given what I've said about how it seems like ordinary speech practices distinguish between engaging in questions of inquiry and questions of answers. So I think what's going on here is that this bifurcated attitude is being brought under the discipline of uniformity where uniformity doesn't exist. And if we dispense with that goal, we can have a better understanding of what it means to be curious and what kinds of mental contents would help us in our practices of explaining and predicting behavior of curious individuals. So we can treat both of these curiosities as internally unified. We just don't need to unify the two curiosities under the banner of curiosity to be understood as having an interrogative attitude, which is an attitude directed at at a question, motivating this project of interrogative contents. Okay, there's one thing that I didn't explain, which I can shortly explain with respect to how I think about questions of answers and questions of inquiry, that also ties to how I see this research program developing going forward. Questions of answers success condition, as I said, could be explanatory adequacy, having a resolution, etc. So what about questions of inquiry? Carruthers has a suggestion for the bees explorations. He says the bees explorations may be aiming at sufficient familiarity of the environment. I think this is actually a good way to think about the success condition for a question of inquiry. And there are other animal behaviors that we can look to, for example, rodent behaviors, where when rodents are constructing spatial maps that also similarly show exploratory behavior that's not guided by acquisition of a particular piece of knowledge. So I think there's a lot of psychology to unpack also that goes into understanding how humans and animals alike stand in relation to questions of inquiry and take and participate in inquiries that are atelic and relevance guided. So the future of interrogative content thesis, as I see it, also appeals to psychology in this more sophisticated way, but also thinks about bringing in new work on inquisitive semantics, where linguists have been distinguishing between the informative and inquisitive content of questions, and thinking about interrogative attitudes as those that introduce substantive issue propositions into our relation with the world, such that we can model our behavioral by appealing to questions which combine these two different kinds of propositions. Here, some places I would look for these kinds of contents would be what Michelle Palmyra has called provisional attitude. I'm also thinking about suspicion, having a hunch, affordances. These are attitudes we have that enable us to explore, to stand in relation to questions of answers that I think would be better modeled by interrogative contents rather than Alice's curiosity in particular. So I think at the end, there's good news. This is actually good news for the interrogative content thesis, because if we look in a way where we're exercising full psychological methodology, there's a lot more inquisitiveness in the mind that we can uncover. And if we look in the right places to do so. Thank you. I can field my question.
Okay, we have time for questions. Well, I guess gonna feel wrong.
Oh, it's like up.
Yeah.
Sorry. So that's really interesting. One thing, and maybe I'm over-indexing on how much you care about the explore exploit analogy.
Yeah.
But I think it makes a lot of sense to think about the attitude that you're introducing as an exploration kind of attitude.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if we should. I'm wondering whether or not it makes sense to think about the more traditional attitude as exploiting one.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like in typical explore exploit model, it's like you have something that's working for you, you go for it. So it doesn't really seem like exploiting is the right kind of analogy there, right? Because the kinds of attitude you're trying to model are like you have a question, you're trying to answer it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like you understand that. Yeah.
No, I understand. I think there's a sense in which maybe the distinction that better maps onto my distinction is high temperature, low temperature searches. But it's interesting. I have them pulled in two directions reading this literature because psychologists also talk about how children over time get better at exploration before they switch to exploitation to answer behavioral questions, for lack of a better word, make decisions. So in that literature, it does seem like when they describe what happens when children switch to an exploitative mode is the kind of thing we do when we're asking questions of answers. But in other places, what you're saying seems much more sensible, where there are two kinds of exploratory behaviors and exploitation is something else. Point taken. I don't think explore exploit the distinction is actually being used in this research program in a way that is very epistemically clear cut, and that's one issue I'm running up against. But that's a great suggestion. Thank you. Yeah, Carla.
So you have this distinction. Each one has two properties, whether it's helic or not, whether it's relatively guided. That raises the question for whether there's actually like 4 different kinds of things going on
because
here.
I can.
I think I can come up with the other 2 boxes in your
really
chart. Yeah.
Amazing.
So I think ahelic truth guided questions or inquiry might be what we do in a lot of exploratory science. Because it's more about truth than relevance. We hold it to the same kind of standards, but it's open in that ahelic way. And I think perhaps helic and relevance guided might be something like what we're doing when we're trying to get to know someone. Where it has that kind of very specific purpose. It's not like you, like, I'm curious about bees.
Yeah.
But it's more about relevance constraint in some way than about getting the right list of facts about the person.
Right. That's interesting. It also makes me think about like the actor-patient difference, in the sense that maybe there are cases where I suspect something of the thing about the thing I'm inquiring into, which, for example, in the case of a person, if I'm inquiring into a person, maybe there's a kind of inference I make about the nature of being a person and how that relates to what information I can gather from the person that makes me opt for, you said, helic relevance guided option. If I think that the phenomenon doesn't reveal itself to exploration readily or something like that, then I might think that it's not the case that I wouldn't want to have a helic truth guided relation to them. I have to go for a helic relevance guided one because the phenomenon just doesn't have enough manifestations of traits that I would want it to have, because, for example, character traits, it takes a long time to see someone's character. What they say doesn't track what their character is. Interesting. That makes me think that I can wiggle out of this problem by saying that no, the attitude I have that I want to have is this one, but I have to aim for relevance as a fallback position. Okay, I'll think about this, but this is a great suggestion. Yeah.
I'm wondering whether you think there could be a relationship between these 2 kinds of questions. In that you have questions where you can generate questions of answers. So, like when you were talking about your own interests in economics, right? That generated in one context a very specific question to a nurse about what. And it seems like the question that you had for the nurse is one where you want to know that specific answer. And I can think, just as a scholar, there are situations where I'm just trying to learn about a field, but then I have a very specific question that I want to know the answer to, and I want to find a reference that answers that very specific question. Resolving that doesn't, resolves that specific question. It doesn't resolve the general area thing.
No, that's helpful. I think that gives me some motivation to say that questions of answers, in terms of how we want to model our mental life, are desires to know the answer to the question. And when you ask a question of inquiry, you can have these desires to know the answer to the question, and sometimes you can just have these desires on their own, irrespective of having an inquiring relation that is more specific. So I think that kind of consideration pushes me against being permissive about interrogative contents in the cases of questions of answers, because I think they're not, we could say, given considerations that you gave, we could say that they're not properly modeled as curiosities. They're properly modeled as desires to know, which are often parts of curiosities. They are tools in questions of inquiry. When I have a question of inquiry, it's rational for me to have these desires to know. And they do have these success conditions. I do ask a specific question to a nurse because I have the desire to know. And I have the desire to know because I have a question of inquiry that motivates me to have this other thing. That's a desire. Yeah, helpful, Jen.
Yeah, I think this is related. I was at a talk by Ariana Hobble recently about, she's kind of projecting in a similar vein, people in this literature that think that you have to have a question to which you think there should be an answer. But then she says something, sometimes bad questions can be a way of getting to the truth.
Yeah.
And also sometimes you can have many questions when you're engaged in one inquiry.
Yeah.
But so I was a little bit, I like the TLIC, ATLIC, and I like the basic distinction, but I don't know that we need to draw the distinction between relevance guided versus truth guided. That I was like, it seems like when you're curious about bees or film in a general way, you're still curious to get truths about the world. It's just much more, it's less directed, it's less maybe guided by particular questions. But I don't know that we have to give up on the truth part.
Okay.
So I was curious about why we need that.
We don't need that.
Okay.
I need that.
Okay.
Because I want to say questions of inquiry make demands on our attention.
Right.
Primarily, and the right metric by which we assess epistemic normativity of attention is relevance, whereas questions of answers make doxastic demands on us. Because I want to index particular psychological faculties to these ways of being curious, I want to say that if you're curious in an inquiring way, exploratory, if you have an exploratory curiosity, it's more important to you to cultivate particular patterns of attention,
right?
Rather than having true beliefs. Like
that
rather than,
but you could still think the reason some things are relevant and some are not is because they help you get a truer epistemic guidance down the road, right? So like, and then of course,
a truth-loving person.
But I like watching the bee movie might make me think about lunch. Yeah. Or what, there's like lots of ways in which relevance might not, I don't know. I feel like in order to draw that distinction, you might want truths to play a role somewhere, even if it's down the line.
I think I can accommodate that. Truth plays a way down the line, but in terms of evaluating the attitude you have, I want it to be the case that you count as being a good case of someone who has this attitude well is if you cultivated the right patterns of attention rather than the right methods of belief revision.
Right.
So I think this is not the only way to get the result that I actually want, and maybe I can come up with a better way that puts that gets the mental priority right in terms of the attitude, such that I can maintain that these attitudes functionally solicit different psychological capacities, but epistemically speaking, when we're evaluating, the attitude has a directiveness, like towards truth also.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
mean, one way you might think about it, to say, but it's the one is like you said, like question guided,
Uh-huh.
and then the other is you might not even know what good questions are,
Uh-huh.
or what the right questions are, or like you might, like you said, you don't have an exhaustive list of what the questions are, so questions can't be the guiding.
Yeah. Thing. Yeah. That's helpful. Yeah.
Maybe one distinction could be like bottom up versus top down.
Uh-huh.
Like, are you using questions to structure your curiosity, or are you just letting information draw your attention in?
Uh-huh. Interesting. Okay, right. I need to think about
Yeah, I don't know if that
that.
question.
No, but I think it will help because there's a sense in which I want to think about the way. Okay, I want to think about attention not only in a psychologically realistic way, but also in a way that gives me reasons to pursue an inquiry. So if in the bottom up version, I am guided by phenomenal salience rather than sorting out whether my attention was captured by this or whether I directed my attention to it. If salience is the guiding feature rather than my intentions to look somewhere, that would be a way of realizing, like, I think top down would be just refer to executive control, which in this case could refer to control over attention, but it is just more about forming an intention to look somewhere versus being guided by salience as your not unconscious assignment of salience determining relevance for you and trying to make sense, form your hypotheses based off that or something. That doesn't map greatly onto high temperature, low temperature, I think, but maybe it does. And there's also other work on option generation. So I might find something useful there about different models of option generation. Maybe that's a better place to look than some of these explore exploit distinctions. Helpful. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much.